We've been closely following the uphill battle President Biden has been facing in the polls, but for the first time since October, Decision Desk HQ is reporting Biden has narrowly overtaken former President Trump by 0.1%, according to their average. Does this mean we're finally starting to see the tides turn in the president's favor? Here to go on the record is Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, thank you so much for joining us here today. Just to start off with, Biden, like I said, has very narrowly topped Trump in the Decision Desk HQ average. What's behind this rise, or is this, as we say every week, part of the polar coaster?
I like that term. Part of the polar coaster is what I would say. I would bet by the end of this week, we might see Donald Trump take the lead back just because of how we see these polls being conducted. They're a mix of registered voters and likely voters, and not to put any of your listeners to sleep, but likely voters are people who are most likely to vote. Registered voters are people who don't necessarily vote all the time. And those two polls show different races depending on who shows up. And so that's why I think we're going to see these polls go back and forth.
Right. So can we expect to see the trend of Biden rising in the polls continue? I mean, you said it would go back and forth, but is there something behind this? I mean, we're seeing President Biden hit the campaign trail over the past few weeks, while Trump has been on the campaign trail, but he's also been stuck in New York City for his hush money trial.
Well, what I seem to think is, let's think way back to the first week of March. So a little more than a couple months, or about a couple months ago now, Biden was about 5-6 points behind. And that State of the Union he used as a quasi campaign kickoff. That's when he started spending a lot of money and traveling, and he closed that 4 to 5 point gap. And now we're tied. So I expect it to say the same as soon as one of the candidates go ahead, whether that be Trump or Biden. And I would say probably about 3 or 4 points. That's when I would say, one campaign is taking advantage of the other or doing better than the other. To your point, Donald Trump is complaining very, very publicly and loudly that he's not able to campaign. And while Biden's out there hitting key battleground states and spending millions of dollars, so we could see him get that 3 to 4 point lead I talked about, but right now they're going back and forth. And one thing I do know is polling and trends is not a week over week thing. If we're going to see a 3 or 4 point separation for Joe Biden, we're going to see it in the next 4 to 6 weeks, not in the next week.
Right. It'll definitely take some time. So Decision Desk has also been monitoring Trump's favorability rating. And over the past year, his numbers have really been in a steady decline. Do you think this is related to his legal issues, including his current New York City hush money trial?
Yes. Short answer is yes. I mean, that is the number one news story in and around Trump, and he's in the news quite a bit. It's not necessarily a good thing. This week, they're going to have Stormy Daniels on the stand, and they're probably going to say some not good things about his past on the stand. Whether or not he gets convicted or not is a different question. This news around him is not necessarily good. Now, it doesn't necessarily hurt his Republican core voters, but certainly those swayable independents, and I think that's what we're seeing in this favorability dip here.
So sticking with the former president, a new Washington Post Ipsos survey shows fewer Black Americans say they are certain they will vote in this year's election. Black voters are obviously a crucial voting bloc for Democrats. So where could lower Black voter turnout hurt Biden the most? And, does this mean it helps Trump?
It absolutely does help Trump, and it's 3 places I would look at this fall where that could hurt Joe Biden. I would look at it in Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Detroit. 3 key urban areas that he's going to need to win in states that are razor thin right now, separated. These 2 candidates are separated by, 1 or 2 percentage points or the equivalent of maybe 30, 40,000 votes in each state. So that percentage downswing, while still the majority of them are going to vote, still that those margins could hurt him this fall, and something that his campaign's going to hopefully focus on if they want to be competitive.
So I want to take a closer look at individual states. We know that former President Trump will make his first campaign visit to Minnesota later this month. That state is a Democratic stronghold, and a Republican presidential candidate hasn't won it since, 1972? Is Trump's strategy connected to Biden's weakness with the uncommitted vote we saw earlier this year in Minnesota?
It absolutely is. It's connected to that. It's also connected to the fact that there's 25% of Minnesotan eligible voters who have not voted in any recent presidential election. And Donald Trump does well amongst that block of voters. In other words, if he can get people who don't normally vote in the presidential election, they're going to probably come out and vote for him. And while it has been a solidly Democratic state, again, it's another state where 60, 70,000 votes could be the difference, just given the total turnout. And so it is a good offensive target for him. And we see Joe Biden doing the same. Joe Biden's trying to do in North Carolina what Donald Trump is trying to do in Minnesota. So this is the standard campaigns, trying to gnaw at each other or go after each other's potential weaknesses.
Trump's also heading to D.C., making an appearance at the Libertarian Party National Convention. Do you think this means Trump is finally seeing RFK Jr. as a threat to his re-election bid?
Yeah, I look at it as twofold. One is yes, I think he is reading the same polling and done the same focus groups that some of his pollsters have seen. As as RFK gets his message out there, he does take Republican voters. But two, again, this is an electoral knife fight. Anytime you can get an extra 1-2% of voters, or at least on another party line in some states, you need to go ahead and take that. So this is a smart electoral college move, or raw vote move by Donald Trump on both just the straight numbers as well as seeing that RFK could be taking voters from him.
So moving to the economy, last week's jobs report was weaker than expected, and former President Trump is already hitting President Biden over these numbers. Plus, we're seeing record high interest rates are holding steady. How worried should Biden be about getting his messaging on the economy out there? And do you think he's essentially figured out a good message at this point?
He should be extremely worried, and I still think he's trying to figure out his messaging strategy there. I mean, look, the economy has been the number one issue going back to the 2022 cycle. So this isn't a surprise. No one can say this popped up on him. It's these macroeconomic indicators like jobs and inflation and things like that. I know that's a good messaging from a communication standpoint, but the average American is paying more at the pump, more at the grocery store, more for vacations, more for flights, more for cars than they were under the Trump administration. And Trump is going to remind them of that. And so that is going to be the economic battle that the Biden campaign needs to prepare for, especially since I don't think, despite what's going around in the world, that the economy will be supplanted as the number one issue. It's going to be what we're going to be talking about in October, is my guess.
So another topic I wanted to jump in on is the variation in polling results. Americans see conflicting numbers where new polling will show a neck and neck race, while another poll will have Trump or Biden leading by several points. Statistically, how are these variations happening, and what indicators should Americans be looking at in order to find quality polls?
Oh man, so this week we could spend an hour on this. I would say this is the general consensus. If I were looking at polls, is you have to look at them in aggregate. Don't trust any single poll. Look at them in terms of an average, and then do understand that while they are specific numbers, maybe even numbers with decimal points, they're not intended to be precise. They're intended to be directional. So if you see a 3 or 4 point separation, don't look at that as the person who's got 3 or 4 points ahead is definitely ahead. Look at them as directionally ahead, given the margin of error. And again, not to put anyone to sleep, margin of error in many of these polls is between 4 and 7 points. So unless someone is consistently 7-8 points outside ahead of the other person, you can consider them potentially behind or potentially tied. The best average to look at is obviously the Hill DDHQ one. We're not biased in what polls we collect. We're very fair in terms of what questions we collect, and we try and be as inclusive as possible, because the wisdom and the amount of data is pretty significant.
So Trump's sweepstakes are heating up with a short list very much coming together. We're seeing it all over the news media. We know that South Carolina Senator Tim Scott dodged questions on whether he would accept the 2024 election results, while South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem has been on a publicity tour of some sort, cleaning up her comments in her new book. How is Trump testing these candidates or these potential candidates, and what is he looking for?
I like that, publicity tour of some sort. That's the nice way to put it. You know what? Both those candidates, and you see Elise Stefanik out there at fundraisers, all these candidates know the best way to audition is to be on television and be on the stump and saying things supportive of, former President Trump's campaign. So that's why we see Tim Scott equivocating on who won the 2020 election, which to me personally, That's a load of BS. He knows who won, and I think that is a perfect example of how he thinks he's still in the VP running. We see Kristi Noem out there in terms of trying to defend her book and talk about how she was talking to Kim Jong-un, which she had to retract, all those different kinds of things, trying to look presidential. Elise Stefanik out there as a bulldog in terms of attacking Joe Biden and the Democrats and fundraising. All these candidates are still in the running, and they know the best way to do it is to be public about their support. And all that tells me is that Donald Trump hasn't made his decision, because if he had, none of these people would be out there doing it or saying what they're saying.
Yeah, you make a good point about these candidates being on television. We know that Donald Trump watches a lot of cable news and pays attention to it. Speaking of news media, though, we're seeing another sharp divide between supporters of Trump and Biden over their media consumption. A recent NBC News poll found that Biden leads among voters who consume traditional media, while Trump leads among voters who say they are digital media consumers. Scott, what kind of impact do you think media consumption could ultimately have on the election and the election results?
Oh, I think media consumption is going to play a big impact in this cycle's election. And it goes back to, this is every presidential election, going back to the first televised debate with Nixon, over 50 years ago. It largely comes down to how much you consume, how much of a critical thinker you are, and whether or not you're consuming news or opinion. There's lots of PhDs minted every year about the studying of that. What I would take away from that poll, though, is Donald Trump tends to do better with people who aren't as politically attuned. And that is new. That has not necessarily been the case for a Republican candidate in the past. And so how we look at turnout, if we see a higher than normal turnout, that means that we are getting some of these non-politically attuned voters out. That bodes well for him going into the fall. And so that is one number I'm paying attention to as we look at news media consumption, is what does turnout look like? Who's coming out to vote?
And we'll be watching those turnout numbers as well. Scott Tranter, as always, thank you so much for joining us here to break it all down.
Thanks for having me.